say I'm happy when I look out in this crowd. I'm happy when I look out in this audience because I see people that are confident, people that are full of energy, people that want to go out and change the world, make the world a better place than it was when they came into it. And that inspires me because I know what kind of society we are living in at this time, right? We're in a world full of so much injustice, so much hardship. There are probably people watching this video right now, you can be sure, who are having trouble paying their bills and are worried about how they're going to make the rent, get by, get food in a low-wage economy. There are probably people watching this presentation tonight who are students and they're worried about the new semester that just started and they're concerned student debt that they're running up in this economy, right? There are probably people watching tonight who've had issues with addiction, or perhaps they've had a relative who had struggled with addiction. There are probably people here tonight, people watching tonight, who maybe they have a relative who's in jail or in prison, in the prison industrial complex. There are probably people watching tonight who perhaps their family is not supportive of them and doesn't support the choices and the decisions that they've made in their life, right? But yet, with this evil, unjust society all around us, I look out in this audience here and I see people full of confidence, people full of courage, people full of strength, people excited about trying to change the world and make the world a better place. And that is what community does, right? That's the strength of community and comradeship, the ability to be part of something bigger than yourself, to give yourself to something higher, to a cause, to be part of a community struggling for justice in the world. And it's funny, often, when someone commits like a petty crime, like vandalism or jumping a turnstile, what is the sentence that you'll get? Community service. Community service. Isn't that interesting? Why is community service, to serve one's community, considered to be a degrading thing, right? Considered to be something that is worthy of someone who's a lawbreaker or a criminal, right? I would say that one of the best things that a person can do is to go out and serve their community. What is more honorable than going out and trying to make a better life for the people in your neighborhood, the people in your city, people in your country, the people in the world, right? I'd say that engaging in community service is one of the most honorable things that one can do. So why is it that that's been considered to be a degrading or shameful thing? That shows that this society is very much molded in the image of the billionaires and bankers that rule it. But I'm very happy that there are people serving their community, right? The organization that put on this event tonight, Students and Youth for a New America, there are people involved with it in Washington State who are involved with a food service program, providing food to low-income people. And there are people involved with Students and Youth for a New America up in Boston who are involved in providing free laundry days and doing clothing drives, also giving aid to people, right? And that's what's needed more than anything right now. We need a mobilization, a movement of young people going out and serving their community and doing what is best and taking care of those who've been left behind by this system, but at the same time pointing toward the way out of all this madness, the way out of capitalism, right? I would say we absolutely need young people to do what Students and Youth for a New America has done and go out and serve the community, engage in community service while pointing toward the way out, because there is no other way. It's funny because, we put out this palm card to promote the event, and, we put, "Is America the New Rome? Will it fall?" and an evening of socialist education. And I think the reason we put, this bottom part, an evening of socialist education, is because there's a lot of stupidity out there when it comes to the fall of Rome. Whenever you hear somebody talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, a political leader, a commentator, you almost want to cringe, right? There's a recording of Richard Nixon, for example, when he was in the White House. And he was really upset, and the show All in the Family had just come out, and there'd been an episode that featured a gay couple. He was just furious about it. And he's sitting there, and there's an audio recording of Nixon in the White House, and he's sitting there and says, "Oh my God, what is this? This is the fall of a civilization. Oh my God, don't you know the last 5 Roman emperors were a bunch of fags? This is awful." He's sitting there. Well, I'm not here tonight to tell you that the Roman Empire fell because of homosexuality. You were hoping to hear that, you came to the wrong event. I found a lot of videos of guys in their Make America Great Again hats, and they're like, "You know why the Roman Empire fell? It's because a bunch of immigrants came in there and took all the jobs. They didn't put up a wall." no, the Roman Empire did not fall. It did not fall because of immigration. So if you're looking for someone to tell you that, you came to the wrong meeting. But why talk about Rome, right? It's thousands of years ago. But the thing is, if you can understand the fall of the Roman Empire, if you can understand historical events and develop a scientific and dialectical understanding of history and apply that analysis and those methods to understanding historical events, if you can do that, you can understand what's happening in the world today, and you can understand how we might move toward a better future. Now, before we get to exactly why the Roman Empire fell, I think we need to throw out a question. Was the fall of Rome a good thing? Was the fall of Rome a good thing? Right? Now, your gut instinct, you want to say yes, right? Because the Roman Empire was associated with so many evil things: slavery, plunder, occupation of peoples. You know, it's perfectly correct to admire Spartacus and the heroic slave revolt that took place in the 1st century BC in the Italian peninsula, where slaves broke their chains and rose up and killed their masters and fought for freedom. It's absolutely correct to admire the Scottish warriors who fought for the liberation of their people in Britain from the Romans, or the zealots of ancient Palestine who fought for the liberation of their people. It's absolutely correct. But that doesn't answer the question. Was the fall of the Roman Empire actually a good thing? And most historians, most classicists will tell you, no, it was not, right? Clifford Ando, probably the most well-respected classicist, in a lecture he gave to the Oriental Institute, he's from the University of Chicago, he talks about how archaeologists have dug up the bones of people, right? And they've shown that after the fall of the Roman Empire, in the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire, the human life expectancy went down significantly, right? After the fall of the Roman Empire, calorie intake and nutrition that people had significantly went down. After the fall of the Roman Empire, things across Europe got more and more unstable. And it actually took Europe 1,100 years to get back to the population level it had had at the height of the Roman Empire in the first 2 centuries AD, right? It took 1,100 years for Europe to return to that population level. So by any objective measure, the fall of the Roman Empire was quite a bad thing. It made people's lives significantly worse. And it's interesting that at the time the United States was being created as a country, one of the most popular books in the English language was Edward Gibbon's book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was being published in volumes. I believe 8 different volumes of the book were published. And if you read the writings of, George Washington, the letters of Thomas Jefferson and others, they were reading this, and they were obsessed with this. And the reason that a lot of cities in upstate New York have names similar to, Roman names or Roman figures is because of that. The reason that in Washington, D.C., a lot of the way the roads are laid out, and a lot of the architecture is modeled on Rome is because of that. That there was wide-ranging discussion at the time of the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment throughout Europe asking what went wrong with the Roman Empire. Why did the Roman Empire fall? What was going on? So, why did the Roman Empire fall? Now, there are all kinds of different answers that people like to give. People talk about lead in pipes. People talk about, different theories and different influences and changes. But every answer you get pretty much revolves around one concept, and that's the decline of the slave economy. The Roman Empire was based on slavery, human beings owning other human beings. And not only is slavery a barbaric and horrendous practice, it's also highly inefficient. So think about it. What motivation does a slave have to work? Their only motivation to work is basically they're being told that if they don't work, they'll be punished. Their master says, work harder or I will beat you. Work harder or I will deprive you of food. So at the end of the day, the slave really doesn't have much motivation to go out and work. Now, if a master has 10 slaves, he can stay on top of them all the time and say, you keep working, or I'll punish you. But say that a master has 100 slaves, right? It's going to be pretty hard for him to stay on top of, all these different slaves. Say that a master has 1,000 slaves or 10,000 slaves. Pretty soon, the master is going to have a slave whose job it is to tell the other slaves what to do. And he's going to be Mr. Popular, right? And then you're probably going to have to get to the point where you have a slave whose job it is to tell the slave, whose job it is to tell the slave, you can see how the bigger slavery gets. The more slavery expands, the less and less efficient slavery becomes. It's a highly, highly inefficient system. And throughout Rome's history, the Roman Empire basically depended on, the growing of crops from huge plantations and the extraction of minerals from the earth. And their ability to grow crops continued to decrease throughout their entire existence. And their ability to extract minerals so that they could turn it into metal and produce tools and weapons, that continued to decrease throughout the existence of the Roman Empire. Their productive capacity, their industrial output was constantly declining. So, what did the Romans do? Well, they went around the world plundering and stealing what they weren't producing for themselves. They became a military society. And in fact, Karl Kautsky, who's the most well-respected academic of German social democracy, he wrote, quote, "The slave economy did not denote a technical advance, but a step backward. Not only did it make the masters impotent and incapable of working and increase the number of unproductive workers in society, but it also cut down on the productive workers and checked the progress of technology, with the possible exception of some luxury trades. Like every mode of production that is founded on contradictions, the ancient slave economy dug its own grave. In the form it finally took in the Roman world, it was based on war. It was only the continual victorious wars, continual subjugation of new nations, continual extension of the territory of the empire that could supply the masses of cheap slave labor material that it required." And this even gets even more ironic, because, as I mentioned, slavery is a highly inefficient system. It's a highly inefficient way of running an empire, producing things. But there were a number of the societies that Rome was going around and beating down militarily and forcing to pay tribute and taxes and taking their people as slaves. A lot of the societies they were attacking actually had a higher mode of production called feudalism. The only motivation that a slave has to work is they're being told, work harder or I will beat you, right? There's really no motivation there. But a peasant or a serf is different than a slave, right? So a peasant works on land that is owned by a landowner or a noble. The people living on his land, they have to pay tribute, they have to pay taxes. But after the peasant or the serf produces enough crops and pays their tribute, their obligation to the noble, at that point, what's left over they get to keep. So they have far more motivation to work, right? A peasant wants to fulfill their obligation to the noble, but then what's left over they get to keep for themselves. So it's a much more efficient system of producing agriculture and producing crops. Rome never adopted a feudal economy. They maintained a slave economy, but they went around often to societies that were more efficient and had a higher mode of production, had a more efficient system than they did, beating them down, stealing their crops, forcing them to pay tribute. So the Roman Empire existed in contradiction to historical progress, right? History was moving forward, and the Roman Empire was doing its best to hold history back, to stop the progress of history. And that flowed through almost everything the Roman Empire did. You've probably heard the expression, all roads lead to Rome, right? Well, that refers to the fact that the Roman Empire didn't allow people to build roads connecting different territories, right? The only roads across Europe and across North Africa and other places that they controlled, the only roads built were the roads of the Romans, so that they could extract more tribute, extract more slaves, and take it back to Rome. They wouldn't allow different parts of the empire to have roads between them. And you've probably heard the phrase bread and circuses before, right? Well, that refers to the fact that the Romans did everything they could, the Roman leaders, to make their people stupider, right? I'm not exaggerating, right? So we know about the Colosseum shows, right, where they would have these big Colosseums and they'd have people fighting each other to the death, or they'd have, lions or wild animals eating people. What was the purpose of that? Well, the purpose was to try and make Romans stupid, sadistic, cruel people who could then go out and do all the awful, horrible things that were necessary to make the empire continue to function, right? And you can see this all throughout Roman society. There was just a constant effort to try and promote the most barbaric and primitive aspects of people in order that they could be good soldiers who could carry out the atrocious deeds that were necessary to make the Roman Empire function. One practice that was very widespread in ancient Rome was infanticide, right? When a baby was born, there was a ceremony, right? It would be taken from its mother, and then there would be a ceremony where the master of the house would decide whether to accept or to reject the baby. And if the master of the house rejected the baby, they would take it and just throw it in the forest or throw it into a river, right? And this was done in some cases. Maybe the baby was deformed, maybe the master just didn't have enough money, maybe the master wanted a boy and it was a girl. For whatever, they would just throw these babies. Think about what kind of person could do something like this, right? What kind of person could take an infant newborn baby and just throw it away? Well, if you can picture the kind of person that would do something like that, that's the kind of person the Roman Empire worked very, very hard to cultivate. They wanted that kind of person, someone who could be that heartless and sadistic and cruel. And actually, this practice of infanticide played a very key role in one of the founding myths of the Roman Empire. So the legend that they believed was that it was started by two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. That these twin brothers were born and that their father had rejected them and left them to die by a river. But then from the forest came a female wolf, a she-wolf, right? Came and nursed them, so they were able to live, right? And they were raised by wolves, wild predators, right? And it was because they were raised by wolves, because they learned to be like these carnivorous animals, that they became strong enough that they could go out and build an empire. And that's how the Romans saw their relationship with the world, right? The rest of humanity were the sheep, and they were the wolves. Might makes right. I think that a lot of the Ayn Rand libertarian types would fit in very, very well in the Roman Empire. Not all Romans could necessarily buy into this mindset. And that's an interesting thing. Not all Romans were necessarily capable. There were some Romans that were smart enough to just not be okay with this way of thinking that was so widely promoted by the empire. Karl Kautsky tells us that among the Romans, there were basically two schools of thought. Among the Romans, you had hedonists and Stoics. And your typical Roman was a hedonist, right? A hedonist is one who thinks that pleasure is the highest good, right? That living for pleasure is the highest good. Your typical Roman went to gladiatorial shows and bet. Your typical Roman, went to wild parties, drunken sex orgies, all kinds of stuff. Overeating was considered to be a really pleasurable thing to do. People would just stuff their face full of food. And it was very common for people to then make themselves vomit after stuffing themselves full of food so they could then eat even more food, right? Now, some people say incorrectly that the Romans had a room called a vomitoria. Well, actually, the vomitoria was a hallway. That's like a mistranslation. But the practice was very widespread. In fact, Emperor Claudius had a servant with a big, long feather. And what the servant would do is after Claudius had stuffed his face full of food, the servant would come and stick the feather down his throat so he could then vomit up all the food and go and eat some more. And that's really gross. It's really disgusting. But in addition to that, you have to remember that at this time, most of humanity was malnourished. So to engage in that kind of behavior is just, it's beyond you how people could act that way, right? But like I said, not all Romans necessarily bought into it. You had those hedonists, but then you also had Stoics, right? Stoicism was very popular. You had a lot of Romans who felt like something was wrong. Something was just wrong with the society that they lived in. There was just something that was not right about it. So, they tended to follow what they called the cults, right? The Romans had their gods, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, that were their standard gods. But they were always importing new gods from Egypt and from Persia and from different parts of the world, right? These new gods that they would bring in. They would follow philosophers, like Seneca was probably the most famous of the Stoic philosophers. And he urged people to live a simple life and be frugal. And people used to laugh at these Stoic philosophers because a lot of them were huge hypocrites. They'd be going around the world saying, live a simple life, don't have great wealth, while charging people lots and lots of money to listen to them and becoming very, very wealthy and going as far as demanding that people who didn't pay to come to their lectures be dragged away and arrested. The hypocrisy was rather extreme. It's a subject of a lot of Roman comedies, is making fun of these Stoic philosophers. But, the Stoic philosophers, the Stoicists, they often engaged in bizarre rituals when they were worshiping these gods that were imported. They would flog themselves, whip themselves. For example, another thing that they would do is, unlike the hedonists that were gluttonous and overeating, they would do the opposite. They would starve themselves, they wouldn't eat. In addition to that, they took hallucinogenic drugs. That was very, very popular among the Stoic philosophers. And neither the hedonist school of thought nor the Stoic school of thought was capable of saving Rome. Because if you think about it, both hedonism and Stoicism, both of them are self-destructive philosophies. One is making yourself just like a primitive animal, right? Trying to basically just chase after pleasure like a dog. The other philosophy is really about self-destruction and the hope of finding some enlightenment and the hope of getting to some higher truth torturing yourself, whipping yourself, trying to live a life of poverty. Neither of those viewpoints could have actually saved the Roman Empire. But every so often there is, kind of a source of irony in history, because the Roman Empire was completely reactionary, right? It was trying to hold back the wheels of history. But it was in ancient Rome, that the greatest class in all of history emerged. Because it was in Rome that you had the first proletarians, the first workers, right? So you had a lot of slaves in Rome, you had a lot of wealthy landowners, but a proletarian was different than a slave, right? The proletarian was a Roman citizen. They were not the property of somebody else, but they also did not own any property. The word proletarian actually comes from the Latin word meaning one who has children, because the only property that a proletarian had was their children, their offspring. The proletarians were people in Rome who sold their labor power in order to survive, right? They rented themselves out to a boss. And for the most part, proletarians were better off than slaves, but not always, right? For example, a slave is a piece of property that belongs to the master, right? So he's going to feed it, he's going to take care of it. But a proletarian, right? If a proletarian is not able to find work, they would starve on the street. And in Rome, they had huge problems with homelessness and homeless children, and it was a huge epidemic. And the population of proletarians in Rome continued to rise. The way Karl Marx described the proletariat, he described it as a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition and to all the fluctuations of the market. He's talking about the proletariat, right? The proletariat, the first proletarians existed in ancient Rome. The proletariat started to become the majority at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And today, the overwhelming majority of the human race are workers, are proletarians. And this book by the well-respected historian Michael Parenti, he actually talks about how the Roman historians, like Cicero and others, just had utter contempt for the proletariat. They hated the proletariat, right? The proletariat was they saw them as just a vile mass of people that they just had utter hatred for. One of the saddest things is that often you would see proletarians and slaves used against each other. Right? So when Spartacus led his heroic slave revolt in the 1st century BC, who was used to crush it? It was the proletarians, right? The Romans said, hey, you may not own any property, but at least you're not a dirty, rotten slave, right? Go out and fight for the empire. Go out and fight for the republic. And they were used to crush the slave revolts. But there were other instances where it went the other way, when the proletarians were rioting, demanding food, or when the proletarians would go on strike. Often the slaves were then used to put down the revolts of the proletarians. So the proletarians and the slaves were constantly being played against each other and used against each other. Imagine what could have happened if the slaves and the proletarians had been able to work together, but that's not what happened. That's not how history went. Now, another thing that people often are confused about is, Rome was a republic. The Roman Empire was a republic for the first 5 centuries, right? For the first 5 centuries of its existence, Rome had elected leaders, it had a hereditary senate. And why was that? Why was Rome a republic? Because a republic is a much more efficient way of running an empire, right? If all of the power in Rome had been concentrated in the hands of one single king, people wouldn't have been as motivated to go out and wage wars and plunder other peoples. But if you have the Roman Forum, where people get up and express their view, if you have a Senate where they're taking votes and passing resolutions, if you have some elected figures, that gives people a feeling that they're part of the process, that they had some skin in the game, as they say, right? They themselves would gain something from it, right? By having a kind of consensus among the wealthy landowners in Rome, this prevented there from being constant civil wars between one ruling family and another. Every wealthy ruling family was represented to some degree or other, right? That was the idea. But this book by Dr. Michael Parenti, it's called, The Assassination of Julius Caesar and a People's History of Ancient Rome. And this book talks about how, even more than the proletarians, the people that the Roman leaders hated the most were what you could call populares. And those were politicians who rallied the proletarians and fought on their behalf against the rich and powerful. And the probably most famous and most important populare was Gaius Julius Caesar, a military leader. if you read about Julius Caesar, according to Michael Parenti, everything that we know about him is wrong. But, most of what people know about Julius Caesar is based on a Shakespeare play. But everything we know about Julius Caesar, we've just got completely wrong. According to Parenti, he argues that Julius Caesar was fighting on behalf of the proletarians and the working class against the rich and powerful. And he goes over some of Julius Caesar's key reforms, right? For example, Julius Caesar cracked down on the lending of money. And he made it illegal for someone who lent somebody money to then confiscate their property if they couldn't pay it back. He also enacted luxury taxes so that these rich Romans that were having their wild parties, they would have to pay taxes on any luxury imports they would bring in, and that would go into the public treasury. And what did they then do with the money? Well, Julius Caesar started a program of hiring the unemployed proletarians and sending them to places like Athens and different cities, Alexandria, and having them rebuild these cities in the hopes that these cities throughout the empire could become, trading hubs and economically prosperous. So a lot of these, construction proletarians were going out and doing that. And in addition to that, it's widely believed, many people allege that Julius Caesar burned the great library of Alexandria in Egypt. But Michael Parenti, he argues and documents in this book that that's not true. He says it's the opposite. He says Julius Caesar was so impressed with the great library at Alexandria, was so impressed with it that he actually created a network of libraries, public libraries in Rome. And you have to remember that was very important because that gave ordinary people, all Roman citizens, access to the public records and to written laws, right? So as the proletariat, the working class, was organizing itself, that gave them the ability to go and have access to information that they could use in political battles and legal struggles and such. The other important thing is that Julius Caesar actually freed a number of slaves. For example, at the time, one of the most valuable slaves you could have was a doctor, right? There were a lot of people who'd been trained in medical stuff in Greece or whatever, so if you were a wealthy Roman, you would buy a doctor, and he would be your doctor in case you got sick. Well, Julius Caesar freed all doctors, so that all doctors had Roman citizenship. He also granted Roman citizenship to all the teachers, and he was constantly freeing different slaves, bringing people into society. Another thing that Julius Caesar did was he actually legalized the Jewish religion and monotheism. There were a lot of proletarians in Rome who were Jews from Palestine. Skilled craftsmen had come to Rome, were working. And Julius Caesar, he changed the laws, because if you were a believer in monotheism, if you said there's only one God, that was illegal, because you were then denying the gods of the Roman Empire, right? Mars, Saturn, right? If you said there's only one God, like the Jewish religion says, then you were denying that. That was violation of their laws. Well, he changed that. He legalized Judaism. And it's interesting because, the Christian religion began as a religion among Jews in Rome. So think about how much differently history might have gone if Julius Caesar had not done that. If he had done all of the things I just mentioned, that wouldn't have been enough. But there were two particular reforms that he proposed. And those reforms are ultimately what caused the senators and the wealthy people to do him in. The first thing that Julius Caesar did was he talked about the fact that all the land in Rome, and land was the source of wealth, right? Land was the mines, land was the crops and the growing of food, that the land was concentrated in the hands of a few people. And he basically saw this was bad for the empire. So he began a program of land redistribution and distributing land to proletarians and poorer Romans, giving them a chance at land. The other thing that Julius Caesar did is he openly spoke about granting Roman citizenship to peoples throughout the empire. He argued that people in the Italian peninsula and people in Gaul and people in North Africa, that they ought to have some skin in the game also, right? They ought to be able to be citizens so that they felt like they had something to gain from the Roman Empire. So he was talking about granting Roman citizenship throughout the Roman Empire. Well, Julius Caesar was killed. He was killed, and the people who killed him were probably the most powerful and wealthy people in Roman society. So people know about the Shakespeare play, a lot of which is Shakespeare's own mind that he made up, but there's a few things that are accurate. So we know that on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar woke up and he was planning to go visit the Senate. And his wife apparently had a dream that night that something bad was going to happen to him and urged him not to go to the Senate. And Julius Caesar said he had no interest in her womanish superstitions, and he went anyway, right? And he didn't take any bodyguards with him. And he actually famously said that to be constantly guarded is the worst thing, because it means that you're constantly afraid. And he went to the Senate, And then the richest people in Rome, the landowners, took turns stabbing him in the back and stabbing him over and over and over again. And he was killed. And that was the death of Julius Caesar. And in response to the death of Julius Caesar, the proletarians of Rome rose up and they burned the property of the rich and they rioted. The senators that killed Julius Caesar, they claimed they were defending democracy. It had to be done. Caesar was just too powerful. But the death of Julius Caesar really marks the end of the Roman Republic. For 5 centuries, they had had a Roman Republic, but that was the end of it, right? Afterwards, there was a civil war, and ultimately you got Octavian becoming Caesar Augustus, the emperor, and from then forward, you got an emperor. And that on 2 occasions, Julius Caesar had been offered to be the king or the emperor. He was in the Roman Forum on 2 different occasions, and these wealthy senators had had a crown. And they had walked toward him with this crown and tried to place the crown on his head. And both times, Julius Caesar had pushed the crown away. And then the crowd of workers and farmers and proletarians burst into applause and cheered for him. Because Julius Caesar didn't want to be king, right? 2 times he pushed the crown away. And that was really why Caesar was so dangerous to the rich and powerful Romans. He was far more powerful than anyone with a crown on their head ever could be, because his power came from the mobilization of people and the involvement of people in the political process, right? Now, I don't want folks to get me wrong here. I'm not saying that Julius Caesar was a socialist or a communist. He certainly wasn't that. Now, we do know that there were a few of these Stoic philosophers that actually kind of envisioned some kind of utopian society or something. Julius Caesar was not one of them, right? He freed a lot of slaves, but he also owned quite a few slaves. But Julius Caesar was a progressive. He understood that the Roman Empire's relationship with world history was leading it in a backward direction, would ultimately lead to its fall, and he was trying to change it. He was a progressive. And Julius Caesar was what you could call a Bonapartist, right? He was from the wealthy landowning classes of Rome. He was from the wealthy landowning classes. However, he made a strategic alliance with the proletariat in order to gain political power. You know, if you read the Shakespeare play, right, and Parenti is just, he's very, very hard on the Shakespeare play for just misrepresenting everything. But if you read the Shakespeare play, you have to remember Shakespeare's writing hundreds of years later. Shakespeare never went to Italy, never met Julius Caesar, had no idea what was going on. But the Shakespeare play is worth reading, because Shakespeare is using the death of Julius Caesar, a historic event, in order to comment on the human condition. It's like King Lear or Macbeth. And what's interesting about it is he's basically commenting on the human relationship with power and authority. The way society is at this time, we need to have laws. We need to have a state. We need to have a government. But at the same time, we all hate the government. We all hate oppression. We hate authority. We all hate power, right? This is a contradictory aspect of the human experience. Or you can talk about a child, right? A child cannot survive without its parents. It depends on its parents. But at the same time, every child on some level hates its parents, right? The parents are authoritarian and making rules and controlling them, right? It's a contradictory aspect of the human experience. All the Roman leaders on some level realized that Rome needed a leader like Julius Caesar, right? They needed somebody who would come in there and change things around to make it sustainable. However, in order to do that, they would have to give up their own profits in the short term. And what I think is interesting is that Marxism, the theory of Marxism has this understanding, that you can put forward a vision, this ideal goal of a world that is so full of material abundance and so full of products and so full of advanced technology that the need for any kind of state can just kind of fade away, right? That coercion and repression can go away, right? That we can advance civilization to the point that people can just kind of do what they feel like doing and take what they want or take what they need, right? From each according to his own ability to each according to his needs, right? That's the Marxist goal of the higher stage of communism, a society with so much material abundance that people can be free and that there's no need for a state and no need for coercion. But Marxists argued that in order for us to get toward that higher stage of communism, the proletariat, the working class, has to rise up and seize control of the economy, of the major centers of economic power, the banks, factories, and industries, and seize control of them and operate the economy rationally, not according to the chaos of the market, and that's how this ultimate goal can be reached. Now, I wanted to just make one final point about the fall of the Roman Empire. Because when you ask people about why Rome fell, most people will give you an answer that involves barbarian invasions, right? Barbarian invasions. People say, well, Rome fell because of barbarian invasions. Well, what was that? At the time the Roman Empire was in decline, you had Germanic tribes mainly, Vandals, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, that were pushing back and repelling the Roman Empire. And Rome, even though it was a military society, became less and less capable of actually fighting them. It got to be so dysfunctional that even though Rome was a military society, it was incapable of having its own army. It got to the point that in the final years of the Roman Empire, there were Germanic tribes they hired and paid to fight other Germanic tribes that were opposing them. They were incapable of even getting their own army together. But if you look at the fall of the Roman Empire, and you look at this clash between these barbarian tribes and the Roman Empire, you can see this is a clash of two different civilizations with two different values, right? So your typical Roman was a hedonist. They lived for pleasure, their wild parties, and they also loved all the militarism and plundering and aggression that enabled a small group of people to live that luxurious lifestyle. The god that was worshipped by Romans was, one of the favored gods was Bacchus, ripped off from the Greek Dionysus, right? It was the god of pleasure and celebration. Bacchus was the beloved god of the Romans, but who was the god of these Germanic tribes that were fighting against the Romans? The god was Odin. And Odin is a very, very different god with very, very different values being put forward by these Germanic tribes. So Odin, he's the god of the Norsemen and of the Germanic tribes. He's got a long white beard, according to the legend. He comes around once a year to restore life to the earth around Yuletide or the winter solstice. And Odin is all about grit and sacrifice and struggle, right? Odin has a heaven called Valhalla, but you can only get into this heaven if you've died in battle. So as the old Norsemen were dying in their beds of sickness, they would take a knife and slice themselves open in the hopes that when they reached the halls of Valhalla, Odin would think that they had died on the battlefield and then would allow them into Valhalla. It was believed that Valhalla was always warm because it was lit by the eternal fire, and that was the source of Odin's strength, this eternal fire. When he came to the earth once a year, it was to restore the life and bring some of that eternal fire and start the process that spring could come again, right? And I feel like as much as very few people in this world are worshiping Odin these days, I understand some of the neo-Nazis out there still worship Odin, right? Some of them. But other than that, no one really believes in Odin. But I feel like Odinism is very well alive today. Right? So every year, they start the war on Christmas, right? Fox News starts telling us that, oh my gosh, there's some school somewhere where they have winter break instead of Christmas break. Or, oh my gosh, there's some public building that is not having a Christmas tree, right? It's a war on Christmas. Oh my God, once a year. And on top of that, what do they repeat during this war on Christmas? They say, oh my gosh, the USA is a Christian nation. The USA is a Christian nation. Well, it's funny. It's funny because I think in a lot of ways you could argue that the USA is a rather Odinist nation, right? We know that US culture is deeply influenced by Germans, right, and Germanic stuff, right? What's the most popular American food? Stereotypical. You got hamburgers, that's from Hamburg, Germany. You got hot dogs. What's a hot dog? It's a Frankfurter, right? The most common last name in the United States is Miller, also Mueller, right? I mean, there's a huge Germanic influence on US society. And I think a lot of the values that people associate with the United States, especially a lot of the things that those of us who believe in socialism oppose, are very Odinist, right? So U.S. society, what is it? It's pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Right? Give it some good old-fashioned elbow grease, right? This idea that you can do anything if you just go out and work hard enough, right? And that you shouldn't feel compassion for people that are destitute or without what they need because they just haven't worked hard enough, right? Right, because anyone can do anything if they just go out and work hard enough. And don't pay attention to other people. It's all about individualism. A man's house is his castle, right? That's very Odinist, right? And it's interesting, and a lot of the criticism that gets thrown at socialists and leftists is very Odinist, I would say, right? So they say, well, that America and capitalism is all about the American dream. It's all about people coming from a new land and making great sacrifices and working really hard, and that's capitalism. And what are these socialists? They're a bunch of lazy weaklings who just want everything handed to them, right? They're just a bunch of weak, pathetic people, and they don't understand what America's all about, and they ought to move to some other country, but the American way is working really hard and struggle and grit, right? That's what we hear from the right wing constantly. But think about it. I'd say that it's completely off because I want everyone in their minds to picture Fidel Castro. Was Fidel Castro a weakling or a snowflake?
No.
What about Hugo Chavez, right? Picture Hugo Chavez, right? Just a pathetic, weakling, whining snowflake. Does anyone here know what Stalin literally means? Right? And I think if you look over the history of socialism around the world, you can see a lot of that struggle and grit and sacrifice. Talk about the 5-year plans, right? So in 1928, the Soviet Union announced to the world that they were going to have a 5-year economic plan, and they showed it to all kinds of advisors and different people, and the world said this is impossible. No country can ever do this. No country could possibly carry out this 5-year plan. So the Soviet leaders came back and they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to carry out this 5-year plan in 4 years. And they painted that slogan everywhere, 5-year plan in 4 years. And they did it. One of my favorite writers is Anna Louise Strong, and she's a journalist. She was from Seattle, and she lived in the Soviet Union, and she saw it with her own eyes. A country that was deeply impoverished became a global superpower. They built the world's largest hydroelectric power plant at the time, the Dnieper Dam, right? They built the world's largest steel industry, right? They brought running water and electricity to the entire country. An entire country was basically illuminated. There was all this planning, right? Or you can talk, I mean, it wasn't just the Soviet Union, right? You can talk about what China has done. China used to be the sick man of Asia, one of the poorest countries in the world. Today, China is producing half the steel in the world. They've got the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, the Three Gorges Dam. They have the world's biggest telecommunications manufacturer. They have raised 700 million people out of poverty. Huge, huge achievements have been carried out. But you can go beyond Russia and China, right? Talk to Egyptians, right? What is the pride and joy of Egypt? It's the Aswan Dam, this huge hydroelectrical facility constructed by Abdul Nasser, the Arab socialist leader, in coordination with the Soviet Union. It's just a huge, huge achievement of infrastructure, bringing electricity to Egypt. Or why is the name Fidel Castro known all over the world? Why do people know about Fidel Castro? It's because he took a deeply impoverished island and built it up and developed it and built a healthcare system that is just the wonder, the model that people all over the world aspire to. Has anyone ever heard the phrase gung-ho? Gung-ho? Well, where does that come from? Well, that comes from the fact that during the Second World War, the U.S. military, the U.S. Marine Corps, was so impressed with the military tactics that Mao was using to fight the Japanese invaders, that they actually started adopting some of the tactics. And what does gung-ho mean, right? It means all together, all for one, joint effort, right? So tell me, the first person in space, was his name Joe Bob, Steve Smith, Bill Allen Richard, what was his name? Oh yeah, Yuri Gagarin, right? It was a Russian, right? Socialism doesn't invent anything, Caleb. Really? Well, who are the first people in outer space then? And you don't have to take my word for it, right? Read Time magazine, what Time magazine was saying back in the 1930s. Read what was being said by Albert Einstein, the most well-respected physicist. You can read what was being written in the journals of the young Nelson Mandela. Read what he has to say. At the time that the Soviet Union was developing and emerging, you had the Communist Party of the United States that was a massive organization. And it was telling people, look, we've lost that American dream. We've lost that American spirit, that entrepreneurialism, that motor-mindedness. We've lost it. But if you go to the Soviet Union, they said the Soviet Union is the new America, and communism is 20th century Americanism. That's one of the slogans that they actually used. Socialism is all about grit and struggle and sacrifice, but it's about building up your community, building up your world, but doing it in a way that doesn't come at the expense of somebody else. You know, people say socialists want everyone to be poor. No, I would say it's the opposite. Socialists want everybody to be rich. They just don't want anyone to get rich by exploiting somebody else or by hurting and making somebody else poor. That's the idea. You know, and I want to say that socialism has actually played that role in my own life. You know, I remember when I was 15 years old, there was a day, and I'll remember it, it was very much one of the best days of my life. I didn't know it at the time. But I remember I was 15 years old, and I went to a Marxist bookstore, right? And I was there, and it was so exciting. I lived in this tiny little town in Ohio. I'd never met a Marxist, but I finally got to visit a Marxist bookstore. So I'm at this Marxist bookstore. Remember, one of these old, 1960s baby boomer radicals takes a stack of newspapers, right? He says, all right, we're going to go out and sell the paper. And I thought, oh boy, what? And like, no, we're going to go out and sell the paper. And I'm thinking, like, so you want me to walk up to people I don't know, try to convince them of communist ideas, and convince them so much that they'll pay actual cash money for a communist publication. Is this a joke? Like, no, we're going to do this, right? So I walk out there and I'm just like, oh my goodness, right? Believe it or not, I was rather shy at one point in my life. And, I'm walking out there and it's, all right, go walk up to that guy, try to sell him a paper. Oh my God, no, just go ahead. I'm walking up to, hi, I've got your newspaper here about communism. You want to buy the, but then I did it again. And then I did it again. And I did it again, and I realized that I was pretty good at selling newspapers, right? That communism kind of lit my own internal fire or eternal fire within me, right? And that's very, very beautiful, I feel like. One thing that they'll always tell you, right? It's one of these witticisms we hear is people say, don't be a fanatic, right? Don't be a fanatic. We don't need fanatics, right? We need people that are moderate in all things. Fanaticism is something you should avoid. Well, imagine that right now you had just had a heart attack. And you're being rushed to the hospital, right? So you're in that ambulance, you're on your way to the hospital. Tell me, is anybody in that situation going to say, now, be sure that the doctor you take me to is a moderate guy. Now, don't give me somebody who's got straight A's in medical school and make sure he's a moderate guy who likes to drink beer and just chill. I mean, we don't want an extreme doctor who's just obsessed with things. We want a chill, moderate guy. Oh no. If you're on the way to the hospital and your life is in danger, you want to be treated by a fanatical doctor, right? Right? And I would say that the crisis that we're in here in the United States requires fanatical solutions. So, if you've taken anything from what I have to say here tonight, take the following, right? That no society that exists in opposition to historical progress can continue to function, that it'll eventually fall apart. And that authority and leadership are part of the human experience, and that contradiction kind of defines us as human beings. And that the day you stop being a fanatic is the day that you spiritually die, right? That's what I have to say tonight. I'm very excited about Students and Youth for a New America. I know there's a lot of great people here tonight, and there's going to be lots more watching this on the internet. Something exciting is going to happen, because the only way we can get out of the crisis that we're in is for young people to start engaging in community service and feeding other Americans, caring for other Americans, while pointing toward the way out of this disastrous system of capitalism. There is no other way. Thank you.